Good afternoon and welcome to Praxis Peace Institute's Friday program. I'm Georgia Kelly, the Director of Praxis. Today, we are excited to welcome Debbie Goldman, an expert on labor relations. She is a nationally respected labor strategist and policy expert with nearly 3 decades of experience in the Communication Workers of America, where she served as research director and telecommunications policy director. She's the author of Disconnected: Call Center Workers Fight for Good Jobs in the Digital Age. And this is the book. It's fascinating to see the history since I worked actually in the phone company one summer when I was in college, I learned a lot about some of the things you're talking about. So it was really interesting to me to read the things I didn't know that happened afterwards. So, and this is also looks at the digital surveillance, outsourcing, and corporate restructuring that have reshaped labor conditions. So we'll probably get into at the end some of the strikes that have happened, the Starbucks walkout, things like that. Debbie holds a BA from Radcliffe, which is part of Harvard, a master's from Stanford, and a PhD from the University of Maryland, which she earned at the age of 69. And we love lifelong learning at Praxis. So welcome, Debbie. It's great to have you here today.
It's wonderful to be here. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to begin with having you give us a little history about the Communication Workers of America, because probably a lot of people don't know who they are. And so tell us when it started, what its role has been advocating for workers in the telephone and communications industry.
Communications Workers of America, or CWA, as I'll probably be referring to the union, is a union of today of over 500,000 people, working people, men and women, women and men. It was founded in the years after World War II as basically the union that represented folks in the telephone industry. Back then, when it was founded, people had their landline telephone, and I'm holding the receiver. You would have a receiver up to your, and the technicians would install the phones or repair the phones. The operators would connect you to the person you were calling or provide you directory assistance, and a small number of people worked in what they then called the business offices, answering questions from customers, either ordering new services or having questions about their bills. It was a very bureaucratic, monopoly, highly regulated industry. And there was, in essence, an understanding between those who owned the company, AT&T, the phone company, and the union that represented 2/3 of the people who worked there, which was virtually everybody who was in a non-management job was represented by the union. And this, during that period, when the rates were regulated, when there was no competitive entry into the telephone industry, there was kind of an understanding that the goal of the company was to provide quality service at a reasonable rate and to provide universal service. So there were subsidies to people who were low income. There were subsidies to across subsidies to people in the rural areas. And by the 1960s, 70s, there was universal service. That was the telephone company, and that was the union. But a big event changed this all. And the event was 1984, when the company, AT&T, and the Department of Justice, the U.S. Department of Justice, reached an agreement to break up AT&T to settle a long-running antitrust suit. And the idea then, this was Republicans and Democrats, the idea was that if competition were introduced into the telephone industry, this would then drive innovation, lower prices, and quality of service. So in essence, this was part of an ideological change that was going on in many sectors of the country and of our economy and of our politics that came to believe that competition rather than government oversight was going to be the way to drive economic growth and quality service and lower prices. The breakup of the Bell system then meant that what had been a stable job for so many people who worked for the phone for AT&T, 1 million people worked. It was the largest company on earth. They no longer had that kind of stable employment. And competition, as we can see in so many areas of our economy, meant that investment was driven where the companies could make the most profits. And that also meant trying to squeeze out labor costs. And as the new companies came into the phone industry, they decided that they were going to compete with it by trying to maintain a non-union workforce so that they would have lower labor costs and more control over what was going on in the job. And this meant that the union company, AT&T, and the baby bells at that point that were providing the local service were now competing with, I wouldn't just call them non-union, I would call them consciously anti-union companies. And we have seen over the past 40 years, since the breakup of the end of regulation and the domination of competition as the ideological basis for our communications industry, we have seen a race to the bottom. And my book traces this by looking at a particular segment of the workforce, and those are the customer service reps and the change that happened in their working conditions.
Yeah, this is very interesting because I remember when this happened, when the AT&T was split up into, well, the antitrust law finally came through, I guess, and we all thought it was great at first. Like this is going to mean there's competition, there's going to be better work uh, environment, but it was just the opposite. And I remember when we'd get these phone bills that were so confusing. I was, which one are you going to choose? MCI, Sprint, AT&T. I didn't know that the others were non-union. I didn't know that. Probably most people didn't. And then we had to choose the local one as well. It's like there was all of a sudden the bill was a mess. And trying to get a hold of a service representative, very difficult. Voicemail hell, I believe, began at that point. So I'd like you to talk a little bit about the destruction of the whole of the stability. The unions really had a place at the table with AT&T when it was a monopoly. So it's kind of like the opposite of what we think we support. I'd like you to go into a little more of that, how it really destroyed the union movement.
Well, within the community, it didn't destroy the union movement within the communications industry, but it weakened the union movement. We still have union representation at AT&T, at AT&T and AT&T Mobility. If you're on the East Coast and you have Verizon for your cable or for your internet or uh, for your internet, it's union. If you're in the mountain states, what's now called Lumen, that's union. But we are now the minority within the communications industry. And of course, now communications is basically wireless or
Mhm.
data or internet. It's no longer your voice telephone. So we haven't been decimated, but we're a lot weaker. And what happened is, and let's start with AT&T. So after the breakup, AT&T was the long distance company. And the seven, what they were called baby bells or regional bell operating companies, could only provide local service. So for about 10 years after the breakup, local service still was not very competitive. It was highly regulated. But already the long distance service, as you mentioned, was competing with anti-union MCI and anti-union Sprint. And what's interesting is how did AT&T respond to this? First of all, they came to the union and they said, we are now going to have to open up about many consumer-oriented customer service centers, because before that, customer service had all been handled by the local phone company. So AT&T said, we anticipate hiring about 13,000 customer service reps. We have a choice. We can't compete with the non-union MCI and Sprint with the kind of contractual wage rates that we have negotiated with you in the non-competitive, in the era before the monopoly era. So you have a choice, union. You can agree to a 10% cut in the wages for the customer service reps, or we will contract out this work. Now, this is 1985 they were talking about. We will contract out the work to American Airlines because they have the most sophisticated database. If you remember the Sabre system, their reservation system, we will contract out that work. Now imagine you are the union leader and you're faced with that choice. Do you accept what we would call a second tier wage? Or do you say, okay, go contract it out? Well, the union leaders decided it would be easier to agree to the wage cut and then try and over the years negotiate up the wage rather than to have it contracted out and have to then go and organize those individuals. And that's what they did. But this is the first example then of what happens when you have competition between a union company and a non-union company, the pressure for the what I call the race to the bottom. The other thing that happened is now computers were coming into the business offices to these call centers. Before this, quite frankly, all the work was done on paper records. And if you as a customer called in to order a phone service or question your bill, you actually reached a human being in a small office who literally pulled your paper records to look at what they needed to do, what your service was. Well, around the mid 1980s, computerization came into the customer service operation. And what the companies did, not only now did they have these digital switches which could send calls anywhere in the country, it didn't have to just be a local office, but those digital switches could have software programmed to track how many calls were coming in every minute of the day. And this then enabled the companies, and this will sound very much like what you might hear about today in our workplaces. This allowed the companies to squeeze out any downtime in the schedules of the customer service reps, one call after another coming into the headset. And they could surveil and track and listen, not only listen in, but record the calls and use that surveillance to track how long the person was on the phone, how long the customer service rep was moving through her screens, what her keystrokes were, what she was saying, what she was selling, how much she was selling. And so the combination of this kind of stress of surveillance and speed up led to and continues to lead to a stress epidemic in the call centers. People who used to have the opportunity to use their emotional intelligence and their skills to listen to the customer and respond. Now everything was that job, that control, that autonomy. And I will tell you, it had been always bureaucratic and there were a lot of rules, but the ability to use one's own intelligence to do the job was taken away because of this speed up and this surveillance. And so these became, in the words of our members, they called it the workplace from hell.
Yeah, you said something in the book about they had to raise their hands to have a bathroom break. They couldn't make any of those decisions by themselves, in a way treated like children. But you also mentioned people getting ulcers, having real stress-related illnesses because of these jobs. Now, even when it was union, because that's the summer I worked there, it was in the 60s and it was union, but they had rules that were outrageous, I thought.
Yes,
They had
yes,
split shifts. You go in, maybe work 8 to noon, and then maybe they'd have you come back at 4 to 8 the same day. So they had split shifts. The people who'd been there a long time didn't usually get those, but new people certainly did.
Yes.
And then they would work people 12 days in a row and say, well, we just used 6 days from one week and 6 days from another, but it came up to 12 days. So, I mean, I did whistleblow on them and brought the labor commissioner in to change that. Now, I was not told they had a union there, that they had a company union that was
Where
part of
did you work? Where did you work?
Redwood City, California.
And for what company?
Well, I thought it was Pacific Bell or, I don't remember now what it was. It,
Well, they probably did have a union. You were a telephone operator, a job that has gone away. At one
right.
point, if you can believe it, we had 250,000 women, and they were all women, working as telephone operators. But the digital technology came first into those operator
Mhm.
workplaces. And you were there probably just before they um, brought in the computers in front of the for the operators. You were probably still plugging in on what they called a cord board, but it probably was union represented if it was Pacific Bell in the 1960s. But you're right. There were many, many, many rules. It was very bureaucratic, very militaristic in that way, and very paternalistic.
Mhm.
If you, I mean, you were a summer hire, but many places you went for a full-time job as a woman. If you could believe it, up until the 1970s, the employment officer would go to your parents' home or your husband and interview them and be sure they were okay with you as a working woman to work there.
Read that
Now,
book.
this is important for listeners who are younger than you and I to realize that the dramatic revolution we've had in working women. And while there's still a lot of discrimination and there isn't equity, uh, the kind of paternalism and gendered discrimination. And AT&T was the classic equal employment opportunity affirmative action case. In 1972, AT&T reached a consent decree with the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission that had for 2 years filed a suit saying they thought it was going to be about race discrimination, but they discovered it was gender
Mhm.
discrimination. If you were a woman, you were slotted to be an operator, a clerk, or maybe a customer service rep. If you were a man, you were a technician. And it was only after 1972, the consent decree, that you began to see women hired as technicians and men hired as operator and customer service reps.
I would be interested to know today which of these communication industries are union and not union. AT&T still is union, correct?
AT&T, whether you use it for your internet, for your video, your cable, or your wireless, is union represented. Now, there's a lot of outsourcing and offshoring, and those folks are not union. But if you go into an AT&T mobility store that is actually an AT&T store, not a franchisee, those are union folks. If you're lucky enough to reach a call center person, and we can talk about those challenges,
Mhm.
uh, that's a union person. If you have a technician come out, that's a union person. And the story here, and I tell this in the book, again, the name of the book is Disconnected: Call Center Workers Fight for Good Jobs in the Digital Age. And it's a history and tells these changes. What I talk about in one of the chapters in the book is when CWA realized the technology is changing. And the communications is not going to be voice telephone, it over a landline. It's going to be wireless. And the wireless, as that industry was growing up, whether it was at that point Southwestern Bell, Pacific Bell, Bell Atlantic, whichever local company was creating their wireless subsidiary, they were created non-union. So CWA said, will we still represent the majority of folks in these companies because it's still primarily a voice landline industry. But we can see the change. And if we want to be sure that the industry remains with worker representation and collective power for workers, we need to figure out a way to represent the folks in the wireless side. The point was at that point, and let's talk about this, what happened in the Southwestern Bell telephone region, Texas, Arkansas, Missouri, Oklahoma, that area. CWA said, began reaching out to wireless employees and saying, look at the difference between what you make and what we make. Look at your work rules. Look at all the differences. And wireless employees said, we want a union. And they would go to have an election to have a union. And the company would fire the activists, close down the call centers. And so it was very difficult for those folks through our labor laws, which is if a majority of folks want a union in a place, they have an election. And if the majority vote for a union, you have union representation. And then, of course, you have to negotiate a contract. Well, this was quite a challenge under our weak labor laws, because if a company violates the labor laws and fires a worker or closes a center to avoid the union, that's against the law. But it could take years and years and years until you go through all of this, the levels, first in the National Labor Relations Board and then in the courts. And the penalty is simply that the company has to give any back pay to the worker. There's really no penalty. So it's very difficult under our labor laws for workers to win the right to have a union. So what CWA did very creatively was, while they were going through these processes, they were also using the collective bargaining process on the landline, on the voice side of the company, and saying in those negotiations, we want to have you company be neutral if the wireless folks want a union. And the interesting thing, and now I'm talking to you out in you're in California. In 1997, Southwestern Bell wanted to buy Pacific Bell. And in order to get that approved, they had to go in front of the very, very powerful California Public Utility Commission. And so Southwestern Bell came to the union and said, will you support us so that the Utility Commission will see that the workers are for this merger? And CWA said, well, you know, what's in it for the workers? You might expand your ability to make profits, but what's in it for the workers? Now, if you agree, you company Southwestern Bell agree that you will stay out and not oppose wireless employees when they want a union, then there can be some benefit for the workers, because then they will have the opportunity to join together and have collective power. And so in 1997, Southwestern Bell said, okay, we'll be neutral. And eventually the California Public Utility Commission and the Federal Communications Commission approved the merger. And then it was Southwestern Bell bought Pacific Bell. People might remember that period. Frustrated because now you had a Texas company buying the California company, and that did affect the quality of service. But it did mean that the employees of the wireless company were now able to select a union free from the opposition of their employer. And as Southwestern Bell bought up other local companies and eventually bought AT&T and renamed itself AT&T, 40,000 wireless workers chose union representation. So I take the time to tell that story so that people can understand that when workers have a choice between a union or no union, as opposed to a choice between we're going to fire you if you want a union and a union. Many, many workers do choose union representation. And then if the employer does not fight them, negotiate a contract, and then they have the ability to use their collective power to uh, make some gains for the people who are actually doing the work. So that's the story of who's in a union. Verizon, I will tell you, Verizon Wireless is not union. They
They're
have not
anti-union, aren't
agreed
they?
to being neutral, and T-Mobile is not a union
And
company.
Comcast?
Comcast primarily is not a union company. They fought very, very hard against uh, allowing the union in. That's your largest. You've also got, what's it called? Time Warner. What did they become? Spectrum, right? Down in Southern California, I think. And so the cable industry has always fought becoming union. There are just a few locations in the country
And it's
where,
become such a way of working in the big businesses, from Amazon to Starbucks to all these different places that are not neutral. They're very much anti-union, and they don't seem all embarrassed about that position at all. I
oh,
guess
they're not embarrassed at all. They think it's great.
they think it's a good
But I
business.
will tell you, there are folks who work at Google, which is, I guess now, um, uh, also called Alphabet, who have come together and they pay dues. They don't have a majority of the folks. They never had an election, but they have formed their own union, and it's called the Alphabet Workers Union.
Mm.
We have gamers, people who do the quality assurance and that develop the software in the gaming industry, big booming industry.
Mm.
And the working conditions can be really tough when they're coming out with a new game. They're working 24/7.
Mm.
And many of them have come to CWA and said, help us get a union. And we have. And this is another very interesting story. Microsoft, one of the biggest tech companies, uh, wanted to buy one of the major gaming companies, Activision, Blizzard, and wanted to buy them. And they knew that they were going to have a lot of trouble during the Biden administration getting this through the antitrust review. And again, they came to CWA and said, this is going to be good for the people who work there. And CWA said, Microsoft, you've been fighting letting your employees have free choice about a union for so long. Why is it going to be good for the workers? Microsoft said, if this merger goes through, we will switch our position and we will stay out of any decision about unionization. We will not say to the workers, unions are bad, unions collect your dues, unions go on strike. You don't want a union, that'll get in the way between you and your supervisor. These are all the kinds of lines that management uses. And would you know, the purchase went through and Microsoft has lived up to its word. And we now represent about 7,000 people who work for those gaming companies.
Oh,
So we know that right now there's the highest approval rating for unions. Something like 2/3 or 70% of Americans tell pollsters, we think unions are good. They see what's happening in our economy, that we have such inequity, such big divides between most of us and the billionaires. I think 10 billionaires now have more wealth than the bottom 50% of Americans. People understand that unions are key toward having more equity and therefore more democracy in our country.
right.
Uh,
The last thing I wanted to ask you is that I want to open it up for people to ask questions, but I'm curious about your take on, and actually to explain some of it, the 1996 Telecommunications Act, what that has done to, well, internet as well as, I guess, all the communications. How has this affected it? What has been the downside of this legislation? Because it also happened under Clinton, as we know.
Well, I'm very glad you asked about it, and it also shows that you're a very well-informed interviewer because most people, it kind of passed them by, the 1996 Telecommunications Act. That act opened all communications sectors to competition. I had mentioned that initially you basically saw competition in the long distance voice communications. But cable was regulated, cable providing video was regulated by localities, and the telephones were regulated by state commissions and by the Federal Communications Commission. So they were under different silos and they could not get into each other's business. The 1996 Act opened up each of those silos to each other. And so you began to see, as you mentioned, Comcast, Time Warner, they began to get into the telephone industry to providing voice communications. And the former uh, voice communication companies began to offer video and became cable companies. And of course, all of this really is very much linked with the digital revolution and the fact that now our services are delivered over our broadband, over our internet. So that's what the 96 Act did. Opening up uh, uh, sectors to competition is in and of itself is not bad. But if you do that with no regulatory oversight at all, the sacrifice became what I call affordable quality service. There's nobody watching, nobody setting a standard. You can't, it used to be that if the cable company or the phone company wanted a rate increase, the regulators would say, are the customers getting good service? And they had the ability to say, if you cable company or you phone company want a higher rate so that you can invest in the next generation of technology, we want to make sure that everybody gets that next generation of technology. But instead, what's happened is that under competition with no regulatory oversight, the companies invest. They put fiber where wealthy and middle class people live, but they bypass the rural areas and they bypass poor people. And so you have this digital divide. And we've been trying to close that digital divide since the Clinton years. In the Obama years, when we had the Great Recession, there was uh, money put to try and make sure that everybody got internet. Well, it didn't happen. Then we had COVID, and we discovered that school kids who had to learn over their Zoom sometimes had to go to McDonald's because they didn't have computers or they didn't have high quality broadband. And remember, you've got a few kids in one house. You need to have high quality broadband. Now we've got, under the Biden administration, there was a $50 billion program to try and get quality broadband to everybody. But you know what's happened in the past few months?
Hmm.
Elon Musk owns a satellite company, and he convinced the Trump administration to change the rules of that grant program so that his satellite company could get their fingers on a lot of those subsidies. And so that's not the best broadband. You really need fiber to the home. So
And
that's the result of competition with no regulation.
the neoliberal dream, right?
You've got the word exactly. I'm not sure all your listeners know what neoliberalism. It just a few words, it means the market is going to solve all the problems.
Right. Yeah, the people on this call all know that.
Okay.
Yeah, but other people will see it later and may not know it, but Praxis members definitely do. So I do want to open it up to questions from the audience. And if I don't see any right away, I am curious about how you see the future of work in this industry, because it seems like there are fewer and fewer jobs. And yeah, what do you see in the future? And I'm looking for hands now too for questions.
Okay, I will answer that, and I hope that I've been seeing a number of people's heads nodding at different points. So I encourage you to ask the tough questions,
Yeah.
the one that you really want to ask. But let me answer that. So we have two challenges in in the industry, and particularly in the call centers. One challenge is the outsourcing. So as I said, there's a race to the bottom. How can we get the lowest labor cost? And first it was outsourcing to other call centers in the United States, which is still going on, and also offshoring, particularly to places like the Philippines, India, Dominican Republic, Mexico, El Salvador, where a lot of the
Prisoners are going.
or kids who, are deported, they grew up in America and then they're deported. They go to and they're sent to El Salvador. They have a very vibrant call center industry there because those folks speak English and know our culture. At
Wow.
any rate, so offshoring and outsourcing is a big challenge. We have negotiated with our uh, companies some provisions that set what I would call a bottom line, a watermark, we call it, where X% of the jobs do have to still be done by our bargaining unit employees. That's some protection, but not enough. And the other thing we've done is we have established relationships with folks who are trying to help working people in the Philippines, in Mexico, in the Dominican Republic, organize workers, because we understand that we need to raise the wages and the working conditions abroad, that's also a protection against the race to the bottom globally. So that's one challenge. And then I'm sure what's on the minds of all of your listeners is, what is AI, artificial intelligence, going to be doing? And I would guess, I've had this experience, and I would guess others of your listeners have. You call up to get help over the phone, or you're chatting on the internet with somebody, and you realize you're really interacting with a chatbot.
Right.
You're not interacting with a person,
Right.
because they tell you to do one thing, you do it, and they say, did it work? And you say no, and then they tell you to do it again.
Hmm.
And you realize you're in a circle and you can't figure out how to get a human being. So what our members in the call centers are saying is that their employers are experimenting right now, trying to figure out how they can use AI to replace the
Human.
human interaction and save on that labor cost. And some of it isn't working. Some of it, and our view in the union is, and this has been our view about all technology change, and the communications industry is a constant technology change. Let the union and the frontline workers work with management to figure out how to deploy new technology that benefits the quality of work, that protects health and safety, and that makes for more quality customer service. Let us have a voice in
Right.
that.
Great. Okay. I see Ben wants to ask a question.
Yeah, you mentioned Elon Musk, and he has had a particular role prior to his notoriety in his turn in the government. But as a tech employee, um, that he's really just like, because he's trying to proletarianize what was an elite segment of the workforce, which was these tech workers who code and manage these systems. And I think that you spoke earlier about how during this pre-neoliberal era, when there was there was a state monopoly that provided this service, that it was one of the values that was being promoted was that of stable employment. And to people like Musk and the entrepreneur mindset, they are all about keeping the workplace in constant churn and having, the idea of having stable employment is antithetical to the type of drive that they want for their projects. And so, um, I think I'd like you to comment on my observation that the rise of this kind of neoliberal ideology is something that I really think, particularly in telecom industry, we can trace back to the 1996 Telecommunications Act. But it's the change in a relationship of the political authorities to promote unionization. Because in the New Deal era, unionization was legalized, sanctioned, defended, and supported. Now it seems like the standard position for Democrats, both Republican and Democrat, is that we allow unions to happen, which of course is very different than promoting the idea of unionization as a way of maintaining parity in the workforce between the demands of labor and capital.
Yeah, I'm gonna.
So that's my commentary. You don't need to cut me short. I'm done.
Okay, go ahead.
I don't really have anything to add. I think you've said it very well. There was a view coming out of the New Deal in the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s. Eisenhower supported this view that you needed unions as a countervailing force to the power of to corporate power, and that through that countervailing force, you would have economic growth and that the wealth that was created would be shared with the vast majority of Americans.
That
Um,
was the Keynesian model.
that yes, and it was that was the Keynesian model of and that was the ideology that supported unions. But I would say many companies didn't, although didn't accept it. AT&T, in a sense, did when it was a regulated monopoly, and it was a private company. It was not a government owned, unlike Europe. But uh, in the 1960s and 1970s, you had an aggressive uh, attack on unions by companies. And a lot of that coincided with the fact that the Japanese, Koreans, and Europeans had now finally recovered from the devastation of World War II. And particularly in the manufacturing center, were beginning to compete with US automakers, steel makers, rubber makers, et cetera. And US companies said, well, how are we going to keep our high profit rates? And they went on an attack against labor. And that was kind of the context for the growth of this neoliberal political economy that you described so well.
And the airline industry was another place where this sort of thing happened, when all of a sudden everything changed. Um, and you had all this competition among these different airlines that now wanted to get the lowest rate for their tickets, and yet they were terrible for the workers. It was just everything was getting worse. The service was worse. The food was worse. The tickets may have been a little cheaper, but we were like sardines in these planes. So everything got worse after this deregulation. And again, it's part of this neoliberal plan. But we've seen this happen since the 70s, and it's been sort of downhill ever since. I see that Jerry has his hand up too.
Um, yeah, I'm an environmental lawyer, and I always, approach these kinds of discussions from that perspective, at least in part. Although I have a strong union background in my family, and I'm very, very partial and in agreement with your analysis. My question is there much discussion in the unions about the concept of economic growth and its relationship to issues like climate change, or are the unions still pretty much assuming there's going to be economic growth and just looking for a more equitable distribution?
That's a really, really good question. Of course, the union movement is very diverse. And I would say that when you look at environmental questions, the unions that represent government workers or service workers tend to be more aware of the environmental issues. And I would say that my union, the CWA, had very close relations that we developed with the Sierra Club and encouraged not just at the top of the union, but our locals to get engaged with environmentalists because we understood that to develop a majoritarian democratic polity and movement, we needed those kinds of alliances. But you ask a much more fundamental question, which um, is the idea of constant economic growth, which it is, do we need to have a new paradigm, a new way of thinking about our economy? And I would be honest with you to say, I don't think there's a lot of people who are think within the union movement who are thinking about how do we uh, have a egalitarian society where when the pie is no longer growing.
Mhm.
And I'm trying to remember, is it Herman Daly who was the one who was the theoretician who was
Economic,
positing?
yes.
Yeah, I remember reading his books, and I don't think there's a lot of thought about that. Which is, as Ben said, this is an alternative to Keynesianism, a different way to think about it.
As is cooperatives too. But we've talked about that at other of our programs
Mhm.
about this need to, in fact, we even had a program on degrowth and what that
Mhm.
would look like and what kind of jobs are there when you're not growing an economy. Where does it maybe move horizontally rather than vertically? And
I'm just speaking as myself now, and I really want to hear from Jerry and others, but so much of what we need in our society and in other countries too has to do with improving healthcare, improving education, people having more leisure time leisure is the wrong word, but more time when they're not in the paid workforce
right.
to pursue all kinds of things. So I'm not worried about that there aren't jobs. The issue is whether those who are producing our wealth, all of that is going up
Mhm.
to the very top.
Yeah, right now that is the case.
Yes.
A
And
lot
a
of
lot of that, where Ben was talking before, the one concept that we haven't talked about in this period is the domination of the view that the goal of a company, of a corporation, is just to increase shareholder value.
yeah.
It's not to create wealth that then gets reinvested in new products and new services and improvements or the people who create the wealth. So that concept has, which is very linked to the neoliberal philosophy, has shifted the way in which our companies are operating.
hmm That's what caused the race to the bottom. This is one of the reasons of our interest in the Mondragon Cooperatives is their motto is people before profit.
Mhm.
And that's the philosophy behind it. It's creating jobs for people in the region, but it's always people before the profit, even though they know they have to make a profit to continue.
Mhm.
They're doing some very interesting work on well, actually automobiles that won't be working on the kind of electricity we know, but they've come up with another way of empowering vehicles that use 50% less of the precious minerals that the electric vehicles are using. So it's a new prototype that's been developed with the Mondragon cooperatives with the University of Bologna in Italy. So it's kind of a partnership in the two cooperative areas of their countries, Spain and Italy. So it's a little off track here, but I just found out about that this week. So
That sounds very interesting.
yeah, I'm very
But
excited about it.
yeah, but I mean, but the sort of fundamental response to my question is that there really isn't much serious thought about the kind of paradigm shift that involves accepting the reality that economic growth is not a sustainable paradigm anymore.
Right. Yeah, I think a lot of us know that. It's how do we get from here to there?
Right. And labor is, I mean, there's a history, even our local history of um, conflict between labor and environment. I mean, it's at all kinds of levels. And like, I mean, the UAW, when they settled their recent strike, as I understand it, one of the uh, terms they got was that there would be guaranteed new jobs for people who lost their jobs working on internal combustion engine cars. So there was just this kind of assumption that there would be, you know, the same level of economic activity, just a shift, in the technology and the energy source. Um, Whereas, with people like Heinberg have been saying for years, it's just not that simple.
I think we know it's not that simple. It's getting from here to there again.
You're right. Yeah.
Gary, I'm not sure it was a guaranteed job. My understanding was that the agreement was that these electric vehicle, particularly battery factories, the owner, I guess it was General Motors, was not going to fight the union if folks wanted to unionize. So it's a little bit like the story I told of the wireless industry. The auto industry is in transition, and there will be different kinds of jobs. The question becomes, are those jobs going to be union represented jobs or not? And so
Okay, that's different than.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, well, you're much better informed than I am, so I'll take your word for that.
Yeah, I think we could get off in a whole other discussion, but yeah, I don't know that that's going to
No,
fly.
I've got,
Yeah,
I think I got a good response to my question, so
great.
hopefully,
well, it was an important question. And really the question becomes, as technology changes the nature of work, how do we do that transition so that it doesn't mean we're substituting what had been good paying jobs with some kind of protections for jobs that have no protections? I'm not saying that the auto work on an assembly line in the 1990s or 2000s was the most meaningful job, but it was a good paying job
right.
because at that point the union had been able to negotiate good wages. The irony now is all this talk about bringing manufacturing back. The manufacturing that's brought back, those are not good jobs.
No, and they're
They're
gone.
low paying jobs.
And they're gone. They're
And
either
they
offshored
are
or
really gone,
automated.
right? Yeah,
They're gone.
yeah.
That's kind of a fantasy. So I want to ask you, Debbie, if there's anything you want to leave us with today. I want to mention your book again, which is Disconnected: Call Center Workers Fight for Good Jobs in the Digital Era.
I just want to thank you and thank all of you for the work that you do and for the learning that you're sharing together, looking at very fundamental questions, which is so important in this time. I guess the only other thing I would add to bring this up to date is let's look at what this administration is doing right now. They have basically torn up a collective bargaining agreement that was negotiated with the TSA screeners at our airports, 47,000 people, just tore it up and said, we're not going to abide by it. And they've said that 1 million federal workers who had union representation no longer have union representation. So our government right now is really aggressively going after and wants to destroy the labor movement
Yeah, it's just appalling. If
in a
you're
way that we didn't even see in the Reagan era.
Yeah, things have changed a lot since then. Ben, if you can be quick, I will
Yeah,
have. Okay, great.
I would say this that we should come to terms, as I said earlier, that in the Keynesian Roosevelt era, that unions were promoted, legalized, and defended. The current administration wants to return us to the laissez-faire McKinley era, in which, honestly, they do not believe labor organizations should be legal. So they currently the National Labor Relations Board is rendered officially dysfunctional because they won't appoint the board members for it. So I think we should be. I had believed that the union movement might save us, but without a cooperative executive and a hostile corporate sector, I think just as we've seen the Starbucks, all of that activity has not resulted in any contracts, and nor will it, in my belief. And I pretty much think until we have a change of leadership, a change of heart at the federal level, that we can't expect much other than unions, other than to hold the line where they're already in place.
Hey.
Well, we always need to end not as Pollyannas, but with hope. And I do think that we are seeing that people are organizing, and I think we're seeing the power of people from various sectors coming together and saying, we do not want to have a dictatorship.
Yeah, the No Kings marches have really shown us millions of people showing up for these marches. It's extraordinary. I've not seen anything like this in my lifetime. I mean, this many people all over the world. So I want to thank you, Debbie. This has been
Thank
really
you.
interesting with you, and I really enjoyed it a lot. I hope you did too. And I hope that, well, I want to stay in contact. I will send you the video link tonight, as everyone else on the call will get also. So thank you. I'm going to stop the recording right now.